In 1619, the very first African slaves arrived in Virginia.
The early to late 1700s. Phyllis Wheatley's book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, is published, making her the first African American to do so. Slavery is made illegal in the Northwest Territory. The U.S. Constitution states that Congress may not ban the slave trade until 1808. In 1793, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin greatly increased the demand for slave labor. In 1793, a federal fugitive slave law is enacted, providing the returned slaves who had escaped and crossed the state lines. The reward is $100.
In the 1800s, Gabriel Prosser, an enslaved African-American blacksmith, organized a slave revolt intending to march on Richmond, Virginia. The conspiracy was uncovered, however, and Prosser and a number of the rebels were hanged. Virginia's slave laws were consequently tightened. In 1808, Congress bans the importation of slaves from Africa. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise banned slavery north of the southern boundary of Missouri.
In 1822, Denmark Vesey, an enslaved African-American carpenter who had purchased his freedom, plans a slave revolt with the intent to lay siege on Charleston, South Carolina. The plot is discovered, and Vesey and 34 of his co-conspirators are hanged. In 1831, one of the most famous enslaved African-Americans, Nat Turner, planned an uprising to be one of the most famous ones in American history. He and his band of followers launch a short, bloody rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. The militia quells the rebellion, and Turner is eventually hanged. As a consequence, Virginia institutes much stricter slave laws. A man by the name of William Lloyd Garrison begins publishing The Liberator, a weekly paper that advocates the complete abolition of slavery. He becomes one of the most famous figures in the abolitionist movement. In 1846, government brings about the Wilmot Proviso, introduced by Democratic Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, attempts to ban slavery in territory gained in the Mexican War. The proviso is blocked by Southerners but continues to inflame the debate over slavery. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escapes from slavery and becomes one of the most effective and celebrated leaders of the Underground Railroad.
In 1850, the continuing debate whether territory gained in the Mexican War should be open to slavery is decided in the Compromise of 1850. California is admitted as a free state. Utah and New Mexico territories are left to be decided by popular sovereignty, and the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is prohibited. It also establishes a much stricter fugitive slave law than the original passed in 1793. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. It becomes one of the most influential works to stir anti-slavery sentiments. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, establishing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The legislation repeals the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and renews tensions between anti- and pro-slavery factions. In 1857, the Dred Scott case holds that Congress does not have the right to ban slavery in states, and furthermore that slaves are not citizens. In 1859, John Brown and 21 followers captured the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to launch a slave revolt. In 1861, the Confederacy is founded when the Deep South cedes and the Civil War begins.
In 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that from henceforth all slaves in the Confederate States shall be free.
In 1865, Congress establishes the Freedoms Bureau to protect the rights of newly emancipated blacks. Also in 1865, the Civil War ends, Lincoln is assassinated, and the Ku Klux Klan is formed in Tennessee by ex-Confederates. Slavery in the United States is effectively ended when 250,000 slaves in Texas finally received the news that the Civil War had ended 2 months earlier. Last thing, 13th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, prohibiting slavery. Swoop.
In 1865 to 1866, black codes are passed by the southern states, drastically reducing the rights of newly freed slaves. In 1867, a series of Reconstruction Acts are passed, carving the former Confederacy into 5 military districts and guaranteeing the civil rights of freed slaves.
Is that right?
Right.
In 1869, Howard University Law School became the country's first black law school.
From 1870 to 1881, there were a lot of changes in the world of slavery. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, giving blacks the right to vote. In 1877, Reconstruction ends in the South. Federal attempts to provide some basic civil rights for African Americans quickly erode. In 1879, the Black Exodus takes place, in which tens of thousands of African Americans migrated from southern states to Kansas. In 1881, Booker T. Washington founds the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama. The school becomes one of the leading schools in higher learning for African American and stresses the practical application of knowledge.
In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case took place. This landmark Supreme Court decision held that racial segregation is constitutional, paving the way for the repressive Jim Crow laws in the South. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, a forerunner to the NAACP. The movement is formed in part as protest to Booker T. Washington's policy of accommodation to white society. The Niagara Movement embraces a more radical approach, calling for immediate equality in all areas of American life. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is founded in New York by prominent black and white intellectuals, and led by W.E.B. Du Bois. For the next half-century, it would serve as the country's most influential African-American civil rights organization, dedicated to political equality and social justice. In 1914, Marcus Garvey establishes the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an influential black nationalist organization to promote the spirit of race pride and create a sense of worldwide unity among blacks.
During the 1920s to the 1930s, a new art form called the Harlem Renaissance would renegade its way through the New Americas throughout black culture. It would be their new identity. In 1947, Jackie Robinson would break Major League Baseball's color barrier when he is signed to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Today, there is a special Jackie Robinson Day where each player wears the number 42 in representation of Jackie Robinson. Even though African Americans had participated in every major U.S. war, it was not until 1948 when Harry S. Truman would decide as an executive order to integrate the U.S. Armed Forces.
In 1952, Malcolm X became a minister of the Nation of Islam. Over the next several years, his influence increases until he is one of the two most powerful members of the Black Muslims. A black nationalist and separatist movement, the Nation of Islam contends that only blacks can resolve the problems of blacks. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education declares that racial segregation in schools is unconstitutional. In 1955, a young black boy, Emmett Till, is brutally murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman in Mississippi. Two white men charged with the crime are acquitted by an all-white jury. They later boast about committing the crime. The public outrage generated by the case helped spur the civil rights movement. Also in 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat at the front of a colored section of a bus to a white passenger. In response to her arrest, Montgomery's black community launched a successful year-long bus boycott. Montgomery's buses are desegregated on December 22, 1956.
In 1961, black students would participate in what they would call the Freedom Rides. This was a way to test out the new integrated laws throughout the South. Over time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee involved more than 1,000 volunteers, black and white. In 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom is attended by about 250,000 people in front of the Washington Memorial. Here, Martin Luther King would deliver his I Have a Dream speech on August 28th.
In 1964, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It prohibits discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, or national origin. In 1965, Malcolm X, a black nationalist and founder of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, is assassinated.
In 1966, the all-blacks activist radical group, the Black Panthers, will be founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. In 1968, Martin Luther King lost his life by being assassinated in a Memphis, Tennessee hotel. Also in 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act of 1968, prohibiting discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. In 2009, a man by the name of Barack Obama would be elected and sworn in as the 44th President of the United States. This would also be the first African American President of the United States. The final and last push for American equality